There is a building in College Park, Maryland, that most Americans will never visit. It sits behind unremarkable architecture, surrounded by parking lots and suburban indifference, and yet within its climate-controlled vaults lie some of the most consequential secrets in the history of the modern world. This is the National Archives at College Park. And for decades, researchers, historians, journalists, and intelligence analysts have combed through its holdings looking for a single thread that might unravel the official narrative of November 22nd, 1963. Most of them leave empty-handed. Some of them, according to insiders, leave with something far more unsettling than answers. They leave with better questions. Among the millions of documents stored in this facility, there exists a collection of materials related to the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy that has been, by most scholarly assessments, only partially declassified. The process of releasing these records has been slow, contested, and, some insiders claim, deliberately incomplete. Congress passed the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act in 1992, mandating the release of all related materials. Decades later, portions remain withheld. Deadlines have been extended. Justifications have been offered in the language of national security, language that, by its very nature, cannot be questioned in public. And each time a new batch of documents is released, a familiar pattern emerges. A fragment here, a redaction there, a name blacked out, a date obscured, enough to suggest something, not enough to confirm anything. It is believed by a number of researchers, serious scholars, not fringe theorists, that among the material still withheld are communications and intelligence assessments that, if read in their full context, would fundamentally alter the public understanding of what happened in Dallas. Not necessarily by naming a hidden gunman, not necessarily by proving a conspiracy in the Hollywood sense of the word, but by revealing the architecture of what was known by whom and when. Knowledge in the world of intelligence is rarely innocent. Knowledge is power, knowledge is leverage, knowledge is, in the darkest interpretations, complicity. And then there is the question of what was never placed in any archive at all, because not everything of significance in the Kennedy world moved through official channels. Some insiders claim that Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, the brother, the man who understood better than anyone what the machinery of American power was capable of, spent the weeks and months following his brother's assassination conducting his own quiet investigation. Not through the Warren Commission, not through the FBI, through people he trusted, through channels that left no paper trail. According to some reports, the materials he gathered, the private assessments, the intelligence fragments, the testimonies of people who would never speak to official investigators, were not destroyed. They were preserved, and they were passed. To whom they were passed is a question that has occupied researchers for years. Some believe they were entrusted to individuals within the Kennedy inner circle who understood their weight and their danger. Some believe they were divided, distributed, held separately so that no single person would carry the full burden or the full risk of what they contained. There are theories suggesting that certain family members were, at various points in their lives, given access to materials that have never appeared in any archive, any library, or any investigative record. Caroline Kennedy was 6 years old when her father was killed. She was, in the clinical language of grief research, at precisely the age at which traumatic loss imprints most deeply on the developing psyche. Old enough to understand that something irreversible had happened, too young to be given explanations that might contextualize it. She stood beside her mother at the funeral. She placed a letter in her father's coffin, a letter whose contents no one outside the immediate family has ever confirmed. She held her mother's hand in public, and by most accounts learned very early the discipline of composure, the Kennedy discipline, the discipline of performing normalcy in the presence of catastrophe. But what happens to a child who grows up inside a family that is simultaneously grieving and investigating? What happens when the adults around her, her mother, her Uncle Bobby, the constellation of Kennedy advisors and loyalists who remained devoted to the family long after the assassination, are engaged in quiet, persistent efforts to understand what really happened. According to some reports, Jacqueline Kennedy was not passive in the aftermath of her husband's death. She was, in the assessment of people who knew her well, deeply suspicious of the official investigation. She expressed privately in letters and conversations in the unguarded moments that the historical record occasionally preserves, sentiments that suggested she did not believe the Warren Commission had told the full story. A child raised in that environment absorbs things, not necessarily through direct instruction, not through briefings or formal disclosure, but through the texture of overheard conversations, through the emotional weight that certain subjects carry in a household. Through the silences that fall when particular names are mentioned, through the books that appear on shelves, and the visitors who arrive and speak in lowered voices and leave without being introduced. It is in this context, the context of a household shaped by unresolved historical trauma and quiet, persistent suspicion, that the life of Caroline Kennedy must be understood, not as the simple narrative of a girl who grew up in the shadow of tragedy and eventually found her way to a dignified public life, but as something more complex, more layered, more consequential. There are theories advanced not by conspiracy enthusiasts but by serious students of the Kennedy era that Caroline Kennedy's access to private family materials, private family knowledge, and the private testimony of people who surrounded her father in the final years of his life makes her one of the most historically significant private citizens in the United States, not because of what she has said, because of what she is not. Her silence in this reading is not the silence of someone who has nothing to offer. It is the silence of someone who has made a calculation, a deliberate, sustained, lifelong calculation about what can be said and what cannot, what can be released and what must be held, what the public is ready to hear and what perhaps no public is ever fully ready to hear. Some insiders claim that within the private Kennedy archive, the materials held not by any government institution but by the family itself, there are items that have never been cataloged, never been described, never been hinted at in any memoir or biography or journalistic investigation. Letters, recordings, documents passed between trusted individuals in the years following the assassination, when the wounds were fresh and the fear was real and the machinery of official explanation was still being assembled. Whether Caroline Kennedy has seen these materials is unknown. Whether she has read them, considered them, understood their implications, unknown. Whether she carries somewhere in the architecture of her private knowledge an understanding of her father's death that differs from the one the American public has been given, unknown. But the question itself is not nothing. The question is, in fact, everything, because it points toward a larger and more troubling possibility that history, the version of history available to ordinary citizens, taught in schools, cited in textbooks, referenced in official commemorations, is not the complete story. That there exists, alongside the public narrative, a private one, a parallel history, a history held not in archives but in memory, not in documents but in inheritance. And inheritance, as any student of the Kennedy legacy understands, is a complicated thing. It is not only wealth that passes from generation to generation within powerful families. It is not only property or name or social position. It is knowledge, the kind of knowledge that cannot be published without consequence, the kind that cannot be disclosed without risk, the kind that is carried quietly year after year, decade after decade, through public appearances and diplomatic postings and published memoirs that reveal, carefully, just enough to suggest depth, and just little enough to preserve it. The archive that was never supposed to open may not be in College Park, Maryland. It may not be housed in any building at all. It may be something far more durable than paper, far more resilient than digital storage, far more secure than any government classification system. It may be a woman who has spent her entire adult life knowing exactly what to say and knowing exactly what never to say at all. There is an image that has become, in the decades since it was taken, one of the most analyzed photographs in American political history. It is not the Zapruder film. It is not the photographs from Dealey Plaza. It is something far more intimate and in many ways far more revealing. It is a photograph of a little girl in a white coat standing beside her mother outside St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington, D.C. on the 25th of November, 1963. The girl's posture is extraordinary. She is 6 years old. Her father has been dead for 3 days, and she stands with a composure that adult witnesses to that funeral remembered for the rest of their lives. Not the rigid composure of shock, not the blank stare of dissociation, something else. Something that experienced observers described years later in terms that carried an almost uncomfortable weight. They described it as awareness, as if the child understood not simply that something terrible had happened, but that something enormous was happening, something that extended far beyond the death of one man, something that would define the world she was inheriting. This may, of course, be the retrospective reading of a moment through the lens of everything that came after. It is natural for human beings to find in images what they already believe to be there, and yet the observation recurs independently across multiple accounts. People who were present at that funeral, people who have studied the historical record, people who knew Caroline Kennedy in the years that followed. Some insiders claim that there was, from a very early age, something distinctive about the way she processed the world, an attentiveness, a containment, a quality that those closest to her sometimes described as watchfulness. What was she watching? What was she absorbing? These questions are not as simple as they might appear, because the environment into which Caroline Kennedy was born and within which she came of age was not an ordinary one by any measure. The Kennedy household in the years following the assassination was a place of extraordinary psychological complexity. Jacqueline Kennedy was, by the accounts of those who were close to her, simultaneously one of the most composed and one of the most tormented figures of her era. She had witnessed her husband's death at close range. She had sat beside his body on the flight back to Washington. She had stood in blood-stained clothing while Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as president. And then, with a discipline that contemporaries found both admirable and unsettling, she had turned her grief into architecture. She had constructed the mythology of Camelot. She had controlled the narrative, or attempted to, with the same fierce intelligence she brought to everything. But control has its costs. And what Jacqueline Kennedy controlled in public, she did not always control in private. According to some reports, she spoke to her children, particularly to Caroline, the elder, the one who had been old enough to sense the enormity of what happened, with a candor that was not always reflected in her public statements. Not candor about specific intelligence matters, not the kind of disclosure that would show up in any investigative record, but a candor of emotional truth, a willingness to communicate in the language that parents use with children when they want to convey something important, without overwhelming them, that the official story was not the whole story, that the world was more complicated than it appeared, that powerful things had been done and that powerful forces were at work, and that the Kennedy family, whatever else it was not naive about any of this. Caroline Kennedy grew up then in a household shaped by this awareness. An awareness that was never fully articulated, never crystallized into a single declarative statement, but that permeated the emotional atmosphere of her childhood and adolescence in ways that are, according to those who study the psychology of political families, profoundly formative. Children raised in environments where important things are known but not spoken develop particular cognitive habits. They become skilled readers of implication. They become attuned to the gap between what is said and what is meant. They develop, often without being conscious of it, a sophisticated understanding of the strategic uses of silence. It is believed by some researchers that Caroline Kennedy's relationship with her father's legacy, the private personal relationship, as distinct from the public role she has at times been called upon to perform, is shaped by knowledge that accumulated gradually over decades from multiple sources, from her mother certainly, from her Uncle Robert in the years before his own assassination in 1968, from the network of Kennedy loyalists, advisors, and intimates who remained devoted to the family and who, in private conversations over many years, may have shared perspectives and information that never appeared in any official or journalistic account. Robert Kennedy's role in this process deserves particular attention. He was, according to virtually all serious assessments of the period, a man who was not satisfied with the Warren Commission's conclusions, not because he was a conspiracy theorist in any crude sense of the term, but because he was the Attorney General of the United States. He knew how investigations were conducted. He knew what institutional pressures looked like. He knew the difference between an investigation designed to find the truth and an investigation designed to produce a particular result. And by the private testimony of people who knew him in the years following Dallas, he believed quietly, without public declaration, but with a certainty that shaped his behavior, that the Warren Commission had been, at minimum, incomplete. What he did with that belief is a matter of significant historical debate. Some insiders claim that he took active steps to preserve evidence and testimony that he feared would otherwise be lost or suppressed. There are theories suggesting that he maintained private contact with individuals who had information relevant to the assassination, individuals who would not or could not speak to official investigators. There are accounts, impossible to fully verify but impossible to fully dismiss, of materials gathered and held outside official channels. Materials that were, by definition, too sensitive to be entrusted to any institution that the forces responsible for the assassination, and whoever those forces were, might be capable of influencing. When Robert Kennedy was killed in Los Angeles in June of 1968, Caroline was 10 years old. She had already lost her father. She now lost the uncle who had, in many ways, stepped into the role of a paternal figure. She lost, too, whatever active investigation Robert Kennedy had been conducting, whatever he had gathered, whatever he had been building toward. His death did not simply deprive the family of its most prominent living member. It interrupted something. It closed a door that had been slowly and carefully being opened, but it did not necessarily destroy what had already been accumulated. According to some reports, the materials and knowledge that Robert Kennedy had gathered did not simply disappear with his death. They were distributed. They were preserved in the hands of people who understood their significance and their danger. Some insiders claim that certain members of the Kennedy inner circle, the trusted few who had been present through both assassinations, who understood the full scope of what the family had endured and what it suspected, became, after 1968, the custodians of a private history that ran parallel to the public one. Whether Caroline Kennedy became one of those custodians, either at the time or later, as she came of age and took on a greater role within the family's institutional and archival legacy, is a question that cannot be answered with the evidence currently available. What can be said is that she was, from a very early age, positioned at the intersection of private knowledge and public responsibility in a way that few people in American history have been. She was not simply the daughter of a president. She was the last surviving member of the nuclear family of a president whose death has never been fully explained. She carries in her personal history, or in her memories, in her relationships, in the inheritance of a family that has never been willing to simply accept the official account, a weight that no public figure since has fully reckoned with. And yet she has, for the most part, chosen a life of extraordinary discretion. She has written books, careful books, curated books, books that celebrate her father's legacy without probing its darkest dimensions. She has accepted public roles, ambassadorial appointments, ceremonial appearances, the occasional political endorsement that keep her within the boundaries of respectable public life without pushing against the edges of what the public narrative can accommodate. She has given interviews, controlled interviews, interviews in which the questions she is not asked are at least as significant as the ones she is. She has, in short, constructed a public life that is simultaneously visible and opaque, present and absent, engaged and withholding. Some insiders claim this is simply the behavior of a private person who has chosen, understandably and admirably, not to live out her grief on the public stage. There are theories, however, that suggest something more deliberate, that the particular shape of her public life, what she participates in and what she declines, what she discusses and what she does not, the precise calibration of her visibility, reflects a sustained and conscious strategy. Not the strategy of someone hiding something in the crude sense, but the strategy of someone managing something, balancing something, walking a line between the obligations of public memory and the imperatives of private knowledge. The child in the white coat grew into a woman who, by every external measure, leads a distinguished and dignified life. but the composure that observers notice at her father's funeral, that quality of watchfulness, of awareness, of understanding something beyond what a child could be expected to understand, has never entirely left her. It has simply grown more sophisticated, more practiced, more impenetrable. What she is watching from behind that composure is something history has not yet been permitted to know. In the autumn of 1964, less than a year after the assassination of her husband, Jacqueline Kennedy sat down for a series of interviews with the historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. The interviews were extensive, they were candid, they were, by the assessment of every scholar who has studied them, extraordinary documents, rich with personal observation, political insight, and the kind of unguarded frankness that grief sometimes produces and that political calculation usually prevents. Jacqueline Kennedy spoke about her husband, about his presidency, about the people around him, about the enemies he had made, and the forces he had been navigating in the final months of his administration. And then she sealed the recordings for 50 years. They were finally released in 2011, and when they were, the public and the historical establishment found in them something that was simultaneously revelatory and, in a very specific sense, carefully incomplete. Jacqueline Kennedy had spoken with extraordinary frankness about many things. She had offered assessments of political figures, Lyndon Johnson among others, that were sharp enough to generate significant controversy. She had provided intimate portraits of the Kennedy White House that added genuine texture to the historical record. But on the question of what had actually happened in Dallas, on the question of who was responsible and why, she had been, according to serious analysts of the recordings, notably circumspect. This circumspection was not the circumspection of someone who had no views on the matter. According to some reports, Jacqueline Kennedy expressed privately, in conversations not captured by the Schlesinger recordings, in letters to close friends, in the unrecorded moments that history cannot fully access, very clear beliefs about the forces she held responsible for her husband's death. She was not, by the accounts of people who knew her well, a woman who accepted the lone gunman theory without reservation. She was, by those same accounts, a woman who believed that her husband had been killed as a consequence of the political forces he had been challenging and the enemies he had been making in the final year of his presidency. But she did not say this publicly. She never said it publicly. And the question of why she did not, the question of what calculation she was making, what protection she was seeking, what consequences she was avoiding, is one of the most significant unresolved questions in the entire history of the Kennedy assassination, because Jacqueline Kennedy was not a woman who was easily intimidated. She was not someone who avoided difficult truths out of timidity or social discomfort. If she chose not to speak, it's believed by many who studied her closely, it was because she had concluded that speaking would either be dangerous or futile or both. What does it mean to raise a child inside that conclusion? What does it mean to live with your husband's unspeakable truth and to watch your daughter grow up in its shadow? And to make the decision day by day, year by year, not to speak it aloud? There are theories that suggest Jacqueline Kennedy was deliberate about what she transmitted to her children and what she did not. That she made choices, conscious, careful, perhaps anguished choices, about how much of the private history she allowed to pass into the next generation, that she protected Caroline as long as she could from the full weight of what she suspected, but protection has its limits. And Jacqueline Kennedy, who died in 1994 at the age of 64, had more than 3 decades after the assassination in which to reckon with what she knew, to decide what to do with it, and to prepare the people she loved for the inheritance they were receiving. According to some reports, in the years before her death, she became more open with Caroline about the dimensions of the family's private history. Not in formal disclosure, not in documented conversations, but in the gradual, intimate way that a parent transmits the most important things through sustained contact, through shared reflection, through the long process of a daughter watching her mother carry something heavy and eventually being trusted to understand its weight. What Jacqueline Kennedy knew and what she transmitted in whatever form and to whatever degree to her daughter is a question that opens onto a vast and largely unexplored territory, because Jacqueline Kennedy's knowledge was not confined to her own observations and suspicions. She was, in the years following the assassination, in contact with an extraordinary range of people who had been connected to the Kennedy administration, to the intelligence community, and to the various investigations and counter-investigations that the assassination had generated. She received information, she heard things. She was, by virtue of who she was and the loyalty that her husband's memory inspired, a person to whom people brought their private knowledge, their fears, their suspicions, their fragments of a picture they could not quite assemble. Among the most significant of these contacts, according to some insiders, was her sustained relationship with individuals who had been part of the Kennedy intelligence and national security apparatus. The men who had sat in the rooms where the most sensitive decisions of the Kennedy administration were made, the men who knew what the president had been planning in Cuba, in Vietnam, in his complicated and evolving relationship with the Soviet Union, and who understood in ways that the general public could not how those plans had made him dangerous to certain powerful interests. Some of these men, it is believed, never fully accepted the official account of the assassination, and some of them over the years, had conversations with Jacqueline Kennedy that went beyond condolence and commemoration. What was said in those conversations is, of course, unknown. There is no record. There was never meant to be a record. But the fact of the conversations, the fact that Jacqueline Kennedy remained for the rest of her life connected to people who had reason to know things that the official investigation had not fully explored, is itself significant. It suggests that her private understanding of her husband's death was not static. It was not formed entirely in the immediate aftermath and then sealed, unchanging for 30 years. It evolved. It was informed by ongoing contact with people who were continuing to think about these questions, to compare notes, to refine their understanding. And Caroline Kennedy, growing up in that household and remaining close to her mother throughout her adult life, was not entirely outside this world. She was not briefed. She was not inducted into any formal circle of private knowledge, but she was present. She was attentive. She was, by all accounts, close to her mother in a way that few adult children manage to be with their parents. And Jacqueline Kennedy, who had spent decades calibrating exactly what to say and to whom, made choices, it is believed, about what to share with her daughter before she died. The estate of Jacqueline Kennedy, Onassis, upon her death, contained materials that have never been fully cataloged in any public record: letters, personal papers, the accumulated correspondence and documentation of a life lived at the absolute center of one of the most consequential periods in American history. Some of these materials were donated to various institutions, some were retained by the family. The precise disposition of all of it is not fully known, and the portions retained by the family are, by definition, accessible only to the family. Caroline Kennedy is the executor of that legacy. She is the custodian in the most literal institutional sense of her mother's private archive. She is the person who knows what is in it. She is the person who has decided what has been released and what is not. She is the person who sits, quite literally, at the intersection of the public historical record and the private family one, with the authority and the responsibility and the knowledge to determine which materials belong on which side of that line. Some insiders claim this is an entirely unremarkable arrangement, the ordinary management of a private estate by a responsible family member. There are theories, however, that the decisions made in the management of that archive are among the most consequential archival decisions in American historical life. That the materials retained by the family and the letters, the private papers, the fragments of an ongoing private investigation constitute a shadow archive of the Kennedy era that, if ever fully disclosed, would significantly alter the public understanding of what happened in the 1960s. Whether that disclosure will ever come, and under what circumstances, is unknown. What is known is that the woman who controls it is the daughter of the man at the center of the story. That she grew up in a household shaped by private suspicion of the official narrative. That she was close to a mother who spent 3 decades receiving information from people with reason to know, and that she has spent her entire public life, from the moment she entered it to the present day, maintaining a silence on the deepest questions of her family's history that is, in its consistency and its precision, something very close to a statement. It is a statement without words, without, which is, of course, the most durable kind. To understand Caroline Kennedy, it is necessary to understand the world her father was navigating in the final year of his life. Not the public world, the speeches, the press conferences, the ceremonial occasions that have been documented, analyzed, and commemorated to the point of near exhaustion, but the private world, the world of the Oval Office at 2 in the morning, the world of conversations that were not recorded, decisions that were not announced, negotiations that were conducted through back channels specifically because the front channels were too dangerous to use. The early 1960s were, by the assessment of virtually every serious historian of the Cold War, among the most genuinely dangerous years in human history. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 brought the United States and the Soviet Union closer to nuclear war than the public understood at the time, and than many people fully appreciate even today. The crisis was resolved, barely and through a combination of skilled diplomacy and extraordinary luck, but its resolution did not eliminate the underlying tensions that had produced it. If anything, it intensified the private calculations that both sides were making about the future of the conflict and about the men leading the opposing power. Within the Kennedy administration, the period following the missile crisis was one of significant internal debate about the direction of American foreign policy. On one side were the hardliners, military commanders, intelligence officials, and political figures who believed that the United States needed to press its strategic advantage, maintain maximum pressure on the Soviet Union, and resist any accommodation that could be interpreted as weakness. On the other side was a president who had looked directly into the possibility of nuclear annihilation and had drawn from that experience a different conclusion. A conclusion that his opponents found alarming, a conclusion that, according to some insiders, made him dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with his personal failings and everything to do with his political direction. Kennedy's American University speech of June 1963, delivered less than 6 months before his assassination, is, in the assessment of many serious scholars, one of the most significant and underappreciated speeches in American presidential history. In it, Kennedy called for a fundamental re-examination of the Cold War. He spoke of the Soviet Union with a respect and an acknowledgement of common humanity that was profoundly at odds with the prevailing political discourse. He called for a nuclear test ban treaty. He suggested that permanent hostility between the superpowers was neither inevitable nor desirable. It was, in short, the speech of a man who was moving deliberately, thoughtfully, and with full awareness of the political risks toward a different relationship with the Soviet Union. The speech was received in Moscow with what contemporary reports described as genuine surprise and cautious optimism. Nikita Khrushchev, according to accounts of the period, considered it the most significant speech by any American president since Roosevelt. Back-channel communications between the Kennedy administration and the Soviet government in the months following the speech suggest that both sides were carefully and tentatively exploring the possibility of a genuine détente. 5 months later, Kennedy was dead. The question of whether these facts are connected, whether Kennedy's movement toward accommodation with the Soviet Union was a factor in the forces that killed him, whether those who opposed that movement were involved in his death, is one that cannot be answered definitively with available evidence. But it is a question that has never gone away, and it is a question that, according to some insiders, was very much alive within the Kennedy family in the years following the assassination. Robert Kennedy's private investigations in the period following Dallas were not, according to some accounts, focused exclusively on the mechanics of the shooting. They were focused on the political context, on the question of who had reason to want his brother dead, and the list of those with reason, if one accepts that Kennedy's political direction in 1963 represented a genuine threat to powerful interests, is not a short one. It includes factions within the intelligence community who saw his overtures to the Soviet Union as dangerous naivete at best and treason at worst. It includes military figures who had watched Kennedy override their recommendations during the missile crisis and who had concluded that he was not the kind of commander they needed. It includes elements of the anti-Castro Cuban exile community who felt betrayed by Kennedy's failure to provide adequate support for the Bay of Pigs invasion. It includes figures in organized crime who had reasons of their own to want the Kennedy administration removed from power. The intersection of these interests, the convergence of grievances from multiple directions, is what some researchers have described as the true landscape of the Kennedy assassination. Not a single conspiracy with a clear command structure, but an environment of hostility so dense, so multidirectional, so institutionally embedded that the removal of Kennedy became, in a terrible sense, a point of convergence for forces that were otherwise unrelated. Caroline Kennedy grew up in the household of a man who had made enemies of this landscape. She grew up surrounded by people who understood, at varying levels of explicitness, what that landscape looked like and what it was capable of. Her uncle Bobby and the Attorney General, the man most directly confronting organized crime, the man most deeply involved in the covert operations against Cuba, understood it better than almost anyone. And then Bobby was killed too, on the night of his greatest political triumph, in circumstances that have generated their own decades of contested investigation. There are theories, advanced not by irresponsible speculators but by serious historians and investigators, that the two Kennedy assassinations are connected. Not necessarily through a single organizational thread, but through a shared logic, a shared interest, a shared calculation that the Kennedy family, in its political ambitions and its private knowledge, represented a continuing threat to forces that had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence as a political instrument. Whether Caroline Kennedy has reached any conclusions about these theories, whether she has access to information or testimony that bears on the question of whether the two deaths are linked, is unknown. What is known is that she lived through both of them. She was 6 when her father was killed. She was 10 when her uncle was killed. By the time she was 10 years old, she had experienced the violent removal of the two men most central to her family's life and most committed to understanding what had happened in Dallas. She had also observed from the inside how the official machinery of explanation responded to each death. How quickly the narratives were assembled, how firmly the boundaries of acceptable investigation were drawn. It is believed by some who have studied the Kennedy family closely that these early experiences produced in Caroline Kennedy an understanding of political power that is fundamentally different from the one available to people who have observed it only from the outside. She has not merely read about the way powerful institutions respond to existential challenges. She has experienced it personally within the most intimate context imaginable. She has watched it happen to her own family. She has seen from the inside the machinery of official narrative construction at work. This understanding, embodied, personal, impossible to replicate through any amount of historical reading or political experience, is part of what makes her silence on these questions so significant. She is not silent because she hasn't thought about these things. She is not silent because she lacks the intelligence or the historical knowledge to have views about them. She is, by every account, an exceptionally intelligent and historically informed person. She is silent because she has made a judgment informed by everything she has experienced and everything she has inherited. The Cold War that shaped her father's presidency and contributed to the environment that killed him did not end with the official dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Its archives, the KGB files, the Soviet intelligence assessments of the Kennedy assassination, the private communications between Soviet officials in November 1963, have been only partially opened. Some insiders claim that Soviet intelligence had assessments of the assassination that differed significantly from the Warren Commission's conclusions. There are reports suggesting that Soviet analysts, who had their own sources and their own investigative interests, arrived at conclusions about the Kennedy assassination that were never shared with the American public. Whether any of this material has ever reached Caroline Kennedy, through back channels, through diplomatic contacts, through the various official roles she has held over the course of her public life, is unknown. But the question is not an idle one, because she has, over the course of her career, been positioned in roles that have given her access to exactly the kinds of official and unofficial information flows that might carry such material. and she has maintained throughout the same precise, calibrated silence that she has maintained on every other dimension of this subject. The Cold War was fought in living rooms as much as in intelligence offices, in the nurseries of powerful families, in the inheritance passed from parents who knew too much to children who were learning what to do with that knowledge. Caroline Kennedy is, in this sense, not simply a product of American political history. She is a product of Cold War history, of its secrets, its dangers, its unfinished business, and its unfinished business has not finished with her. On September 24th, 1964, the Warren Commission delivered its report to President Lyndon Johnson. And the report ran to nearly 900 pages, contained the testimony of hundreds of witnesses, and reached a conclusion that it presented as definitive. Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, had assassinated President Kennedy. There was no conspiracy, there was no second gunman, there was no coordinated plot. There was one disturbed man with a rifle and a history of political grievance, and that was the full extent of what had happened in Dallas. The Kennedy family's response to this conclusion was, in public, one of formal acceptance. There were no press conferences condemning the report. There were no public statements calling for further investigation. The family maintained, in its public posture, the dignified silence of people who had accepted an official finding and were attempting to move forward with their lives. This was, in retrospect, entirely consistent with the Kennedy family's general approach to its private knowledge, the careful management of public presentation in the service of objectives that could not be fully disclosed, because in private the picture was entirely different. According to some reports, Robert Kennedy's response to the Warren Commission's conclusions was one of deep and sustained skepticism. He was, by the accounts of people close to him, unconvinced by the lone gunman finding. He was unconvinced not as a matter of emotional denial, not because he could not bear to accept that his brother had been killed by a random act of violence rather than a political one, but as a matter of professional judgment. As a former attorney general and the country's chief law enforcement officer, he understood what a thorough investigation looked like, and he did not believe the Warren Commission's investigation had been thorough. His specific concerns, according to various accounts, centered on several dimensions of the investigation that he found inadequate or suspicious: the handling of evidence, the selection and treatment of witnesses, the investigation of Oswald's background, and the networks he had been connected to, and the relationship between the FBI and the CIA and the Commission itself. Robert Kennedy understood, in ways that very few people outside the intelligence and law enforcement communities could, how institutional pressures operated. He understood how investigations could be shaped at subtle and not so subtle levels to produce particular results, and he believed, according to the private testimony of those who knew him well, that this was exactly what had happened. He was not alone in this belief. A significant portion of the Kennedy inner circle, the advisors, the loyalists, the people who had been closest to the president in the final years of his life, did not accept the Warren Commission's conclusions. Some of them said so privately in the years following the report. Some of them in later years said so in print. The consistent thread running through these accounts is not the claim of a specific alternative conspiracy theory. It is something more fundamental, a rejection of the adequacy of the investigation itself, a conviction that the full truth had not been sought and therefore had not been found. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, which conducted its own investigation in the late 1970s, ultimately concluded that Kennedy was probably killed as the result of a conspiracy, though it could not identify the specific conspiratorial organization responsible. This finding, buried in the complex qualifications of a government report delivered more than a decade after the assassination, never fully integrated into the official public narrative, represented a significant official departure from the Warren Commission's conclusions, and yet it has been largely marginalized in the popular understanding of the assassination. The lone gunman theory has remained, in most mainstream accounts, the default position. The committee's conspiracy finding has been treated as a curiosity rather than a landmark. How did Caroline Kennedy respond to the House Select Committee's findings? What was her private assessment? These are questions that have no public answers. She has not, in any available record, made substantive public statements about the competing theories of her father's assassination. She has participated in commemorations. She has spoken movingly about her father's legacy, his character, his impact on American life. She has on occasion addressed the grief and loss of the assassination in personal terms. But on the central historical question, when on the question of who was responsible and why, she has maintained a silence that is, in its consistency and its duration, remarkable. Some insiders claim this silence reflects a genuine personal decision to stay out of a debate that she finds painful and that she does not believe she can productively influence. There are theories, however, that the silence is more strategic than personal, that the particular position Caroline Kennedy occupies as the primary living representative of the assassination's immediate family, as the custodian of the private Kennedy archive, as a person with relationships throughout the American political and intelligence establishment, makes it necessary for her to be, on the specific question, precisely as noncommittal as she appears to be, because to speak would be to commit. To acknowledge private knowledge would be to invite scrutiny of what that knowledge contains. To express skepticism of the official narrative would be to open a door that, once opened, could not easily be closed. And to open that door would mean confronting not only the question of what happened in Dallas, but the question of what happened in the decades since, the question of what has been withheld and why and by whom and at whose instruction. The Warren Commission's report has been supplemented, contested, and in some dimensions significantly contradicted by subsequent investigations and document releases. The documents released in recent decades have provided substantial new information about Oswald's contacts with intelligence agencies, about the surveillance of Oswald in the period before the assassination, about the institutional knowledge that existed within various agencies regarding his presence in Dallas. None of this information has produced a clean, definitive alternative narrative, but it has, in the assessment of serious researchers, substantially undermined the confidence with which the lone gunman conclusion can be maintained. Caroline Kennedy has had access through her various public roles and her family's institutional connections to more of this information than most people. She has been, over the course of her career, in contact with people throughout the American national security establishment. She has served as ambassador to Japan, a posting that gave her access to classified briefings and to the networks of officials who hold the most sensitive information in the American government. She has been, throughout her adult life, a figure of sufficient significance and trust that the people who carry the private knowledge of American power have, at various times, been willing to share pieces of that knowledge with her. What she has done with what she has learned is the central question that this history keeps returning to. And the answer, each time the question is posed, is the same. She has kept it, she has held it, she has added it to the accumulation of private knowledge that she carries with the same composure and the same watchfulness that observers notice in a 6-year-old girl in a white coat standing at the edge of history. The Warren Commission told a story. It was not a story the Kennedy family ever fully accepted. And the person who is the last surviving member of the family that was most directly affected by its conclusions, the person who has the deepest personal investment in its truth or falsity, has chosen for more than 60 years not to tell a different one. The silence around that choice is louder than any testimony could be. In 2013, President Barack Obama nominated Caroline Kennedy to serve as the United States ambassador to Japan. The appointment was received in most public commentary as a sentimental gesture, the daughter of a beloved president given a prestigious posting as recognition of her family's legacy and her own decades of quiet public service. It was, in this reading, an honorific, a reward, a way of honoring the Kennedy name in a ceremonially appropriate fashion. There are theories, however, that this reading missed something important. Because the ambassadorship to Japan is not, in the architecture of American foreign policy and intelligence operations, a purely ceremonial position. Japan is the cornerstone of American strategic presence in Asia. It is the host of some of the most significant American military installations in the world. It sits at the intersection of American interests in China, North Korea, and the broader Indo-Pacific region. The ambassador to Japan is, in the daily operational reality of American foreign policy, a figure of genuine strategic importance, with access to classified intelligence assessments, to sensitive diplomatic communications, and to the private channels through which the most significant decisions of American foreign policy are actually made. Caroline Kennedy served in this role for 3 years, from 2013 to 2017. During that period, she was present for some of the most significant developments in the strategic landscape of East Asia. She had access to intelligence briefings of the kind that very few people outside the classified national security apparatus ever receive. She was privy to the private communications of the American government at a level of sensitivity that is difficult for ordinary citizens to fully appreciate. And she did all of this while remaining, on the questions that concern us here, completely silent. Some insiders claim there is no particular significance in this observation, and ambassadors receive classified briefings as a matter of professional necessity. The information they receive in those briefings is, by definition, not for public disclosure. The confidentiality of diplomatic communications is a fundamental principle of the entire international order. There is nothing remarkable in this reading about a former ambassador who does not publicly disclose the intelligence she received in the course of her duties. This is entirely correct. And it would be entirely unremarkable except for one thing. The information that Caroline Kennedy was receiving in Tokyo was not arriving in a vacuum. It was arriving in the mind of a woman who already carried an extraordinary accumulation of private historical knowledge. Knowledge about her father's presidency, knowledge about the intelligence community that had surrounded and, according to some theories, conspired against him. Knowledge about the networks of power and concealment that have shaped American policy since the 1960s. The classified briefings of an ambassador are, for most recipients, new information in a relatively empty vessel. For Caroline Kennedy, they were additions to an already extraordinary private archive. What does it mean to receive current intelligence about, for instance, North Korean capabilities or Chinese strategic intentions when you are also the person who has, over the course of a lifetime, received private information about the way American intelligence agencies have historically operated, including in the period when those agencies may have been involved in the death of your own father? What does it mean to sit in diplomatic meetings with Japanese officials who have their own intelligence services and their own private assessments of American history when you are the primary living repository of the most contested private history in American political life? These questions cannot be answered, but they suggest a dimension of Caroline Kennedy's ambassadorial experience that the congratulatory coverage of her appointment did not address. They suggest that her time in Tokyo was not simply a matter of a distinguished American serving her country in a prestigious posting. It was the latest chapter in a lifelong accumulation of knowledge, official and unofficial, classified and private, institutional and personal, that has made her, over the decades, into something that no official title fully captures. She is, according to some insiders, one of the most informed private citizens in the United States, not by virtue of any single role or any single source of information, but by virtue of the extraordinary convergence in one person of personal inheritance, family history, private access, and official experience. She has been, for her entire adult life, at the intersection of the most sensitive currents of American historical and political life. And she has navigated that intersection with a skill and a discretion that is, in its way, as remarkable as anything her father achieved. Her role as custodian of the Kennedy legacy extends far beyond the management of her mother's archive or the administration of various Kennedy-related foundations and commemorative projects. She is, in a more fundamental sense, the living custodian of a historical understanding that exists nowhere else. The people who surrounded her father in the final years of his life are almost entirely gone. The people who conducted private investigations in the aftermath of the assassination are gone. The people who knew what Bobby Kennedy knew and who shared pieces of that knowledge with the family over the following decades are, in most cases, gone. The private history they carried has passed to her or has not passed at all. This is what makes her position in the long view of history so singular, not what she has said, not what she has done, but what she holds, the private understanding of a period that has shaped American life for more than 60 years. An understanding that is, by its nature, impossible to fully reconstruct from the public record, an understanding that lives only in her, in the accumulated inheritance of a lifetime spent at the center of the most consequential, unresolved mystery in modern American history. According to some reports, there have been moments, private conversations, unguarded remarks, the occasional comment that was not intended for wider circulation, in which Caroline Kennedy has hinted at the dimensions of what she carries, not in explicit disclosure, not in anything that could be quoted or cited or used as the basis for a specific historical claim, but in the kind of indirection that people who carry significant private knowledge sometimes allow themselves, a reference to complexity, an acknowledgement that the public record is incomplete, a comment that suggests awareness of facts not contained in any available source. Whether these moments represent genuine glimpses of private knowledge or simply the natural hedging of an intelligent and historically informed person, someone who knows that history is always more complex than its official accounts, is impossible to say with certainty. But they are, for those who have observed them, suggestive. They point toward a private understanding that is not fully captured by anything available in the public record. She has been asked on various occasions about her father's assassination, about the Warren Commission, about the competing theories that have accumulated over decades. Her responses have been consistently brief and carefully noncommittal. She has expressed that the loss was profound. She has acknowledged that the questions remain open for many people. She has not dismissed the skeptics. She has not endorsed their specific claims. She has maintained in the precise calibration that a lifetime of practice has made possible exactly the position that preserves maximum privacy while offering minimum offense. This calibration is, it is believed by those who study her public appearances carefully, itself a kind of statement. It is too consistent to be accidental, too precise to be simply the product of grief-induced avoidance. It is the behavior of someone who has thought carefully about this question, who has made deliberate choices about how to engage with it in public, and who has arrived at a position of deliberate, sustained, strategic ambiguity. The keeper of the archive is also its most important item, and she is an item that cannot be cataloged. In October of 2017, the Trump administration released a new tranche of previously classified documents related to the Kennedy assassination. The release was significant. Thousands of documents, some of them never before seen by the public, covering a wide range of subjects related to the assassination and its investigation. And then, quietly and without significant public resistance, the administration withheld thousands more. The justification, as it had been in every previous partial release, was national security. This pattern, the partial release, the continued withholding, the deferral to national security classifications that cannot be publicly explained or contested, has been the defining feature of the official management of Kennedy assassination documents for more than 6 decades. And each new release has followed the same pattern. Enough material to satisfy the letter of the declassification mandate, not enough to satisfy the spirit of it. Fragments that add to the picture without completing it. Among the materials that have been released over the years are documents that shed significant light on the activities of Lee Harvey Oswald in the period before the assassination, on his contacts with Cuban exile organizations, on his interactions with intelligence-connected individuals, on the surveillance that was being maintained on him by multiple agencies, on the extraordinary and still not fully explained fact that a man with his background and his connections was nevertheless allowed to travel internationally, return to the United States without incident, and position himself in Dallas without triggering the kind of institutional response that his profile would seem to have warranted. Some insiders claim that these documents, read together and in context, suggest a level of institutional awareness of Oswald that is difficult to reconcile with the Warren Commission's portrait of him as a lone and unconnected actor. There are theories, supported by specific documents and specific evidentiary threads, that Oswald had some form of relationship with one or more American intelligence agencies, that he was not simply a private individual who acquired a rifle and acted on his own grievances, that he was connected in ways that have never been fully traced to networks of people and organizations that were themselves connected to the broader landscape of Cold War covert operations. Whether these connections made him a knowing participant in a conspiracy, an unwitting instrument of one, or simply a man who moved in circles where dangerous people operated and was then conveniently available as a scapegoat, these questions remain, despite the released documents, unresolved. What the documents do establish is that the official account has significant gaps that were known to exist at the time of the Warren Commission investigation, gaps that the Commission chose not to pursue. Gaps that subsequent document releases have enlarged rather than closed. The Kennedy family's response to each new document release has been consistently silence, no public statements, no acknowledgement that the released materials are consistent with or contradictory to the family's private understanding, no comment on the significance of specific findings. The silence is maintained with the same consistency and the same precision as on every other dimension of this subject. And Caroline Kennedy, as the family's primary public representative, is the face of that silence. According to some reports, she has been briefed at various points over the years on the contents of materials that were pending declassification. This would be consistent with the access that someone of her prominence, connections, and demonstrated discretion might be expected to receive. If true, it means that she has known, in some cases years in advance of public release, what particular documents contain. She has been able to absorb in advance the implications of each new release, to prepare, if necessary, the family's response, to make whatever private adjustments to her own understanding the new material requires. Whether she has been surprised by anything that has been released, whether any document has contained information that contradicts or supplements the private picture she already carries, is unknown, but the possibility that she has had advance access to at least some of the classified materials is not a fringe suggestion. It is, given her background and her connections, a reasonable inference. There are theories suggesting that the Kennedy family has, at various points, made representations to the government about the declassification process, not lobbying for fuller disclosure, not lobbying for continued withholding, but making the kind of quiet, carefully calibrated interventions that powerful and well-connected families are sometimes in a position to make. Representations about the handling of materials that touch on the family's most intimate history. Whether these representations have influenced the pace or scope of declassification is impossible to know. But the suggestion that the family has been entirely passive in the process, that it has simply waited, like everyone else, for the official machinery to produce its results, seems, in the light of the family's known habits and capacities, unlikely. Among the materials that remain classified, according to various sources familiar with the holdings, are communications between American intelligence agencies and their foreign counterparts relating to the assassination. Communications that may shed light on what other governments knew and when, on what intelligence was shared across borders, on the international dimensions of the Kennedy assassination that the domestic-focused Warren Commission investigation did not fully explore. These international dimensions are, in the assessment of serious researchers, significantly underexplored in the public account. The assassination of an American president is not a purely domestic event. It reverberates through the entire international order. It is assessed and analyzed by every major intelligence service in the world. And those intelligence services, some of them far less constrained in their investigations than the American institutions that were simultaneously managing the official narrative, may have reached conclusions that were never shared with the American public. Caroline Kennedy, in her role as ambassador to Japan, would have had access to at least some of the intelligence flows between American and Japanese agencies. She would have been in contact, through diplomatic channels, with individuals who had access to a wider range of international intelligence assessments. The extent to which any of this material touched on the Kennedy assassination, whether in the form of archival references, intelligence history discussions, or the private conversations that occur between senior officials when the cameras are not present, is, of course, unknown. But the pattern is consistent. Everywhere she has been in a position to receive information. Everywhere she has received it with the same composed attentiveness that she brought to everything. And everywhere she has maintained the same silence on the questions that matter most. The documents that were never meant to be found are perhaps not documents at all. They are the things that a woman has learned over the course of a lifetime and carried with extraordinary discipline into a silence that the public record will never fully penetrate. There is a particular quality of silence that is different from simple absence of speech. There is the silence of someone who has nothing to say. There is the silence of someone who is grieving. There is the silence of someone who is cautious. And then there is the silence of someone who has weighed what they know against what the world can bear to hear and made a judgment. This last silence has a texture, it has a weight. People who have been in the presence of it sometimes describe the sensation of being adjacent to something enormous and contained, like standing next to a large, perfectly sealed vault. Those who have observed Caroline Kennedy in contexts where her father's assassination has come up, in interviews and public appearances, in the occasional semi-private conversation that has found its way into the historical record, consistently describe something like this sensation. Not the impression of someone who is avoiding a painful subject, not the impression of someone who is protecting her privacy from intrusion, the impression of someone who is managing a very specific and very heavy thing, someone who knows exactly what she is not saying and exactly why she is not saying it. Some insiders claim this impression is an artifact of the public's tendency to project significance onto the silence of historically prominent figures. There are theories, however, that the impression is itself a form of evidence. That the consistent, precisely calibrated nature of Caroline Kennedy's silence on these specific questions, a silence maintained across 6 decades in dozens of different public and private contexts under varying degrees of pressure and opportunity, is not something that happens accidentally. It is the product of sustained, deliberate, conscious effort, and sustained, deliberate, conscious effort of this kind does not typically accompany the absence of knowledge. It accompanies its presence. The things she has never said fall into several categories. She has never publicly expressed any doubt about the Warren Commission's conclusions. She has never publicly endorsed any alternative theory of the assassination. She has never described in any available record the substance of any private conversation she may have had with her mother, her uncle, or any member of the Kennedy inner circle about the assassination. She has never commented on the significance of any specific document released in the declassification process. She has never suggested in any direct or indirect way that she has access to private knowledge about her father's death that differs from the public record. This is a very specific silence. It is not a general silence about her father's life or legacy. She has spoken at length on many occasions about his character, his presidency, his vision for America. She has written about him. She has edited collections of his speeches and letters. She has participated in commemorations and has been in many ways an active and engaged keeper of his public legacy. The silence is specific to the assassination, to the question of what happened, to the question of who was responsible, to the question of what she knows. The specificity of the silence is, in the reading of those who have studied her public record carefully, significant. It suggests awareness of where the dangerous territory begins. It suggests a conscious drawing of a line. On this side, the things that can be said, on that side, the things that cannot. And the line is drawn consistently at exactly the point where private knowledge would begin to speak. According to some reports, there have been moments over the years when the silence has come under particular pressure, when journalists have pushed harder than usual, when document releases have produced specific findings that seem to demand a response from the family, when public figures have made statements about the assassination that might logically invite a reaction from the Kennedy family's primary representative. In each of these moments, the silence has held, not with the awkwardness of someone who is scrambling to avoid a question, with the ease of someone who has long since made their peace with not answering it. This ease is, in its way, the most revealing aspect of the silence. Because silence maintained under pressure is exhausting. It requires effort. It requires the constant active suppression of the impulse to speak, to clarify, to set the record straight. Silence that has become effortless. Silence that is no longer a matter of suppression, but simply of settled disposition. Is the silence of someone who has, at some point in the past, made a decision so complete and so final that the question of speaking has simply ceased to arise. When did that decision get made? What was the moment or the process or the accumulation of understanding that produced it? These questions cannot be answered from the outside, but the timeline of her life provides some suggestive coordinates. She was, in her earliest years, a child absorbing a household of controlled grief and private suspicion. She was, in her adolescence and young adulthood, a person who lost her mother, the primary transmitter of private Kennedy history, in 1994. She was, in her middle age, the custodian of a private archive and the manager of a family legacy that places her, daily and in perpetuity, at the intersection of public memory and private knowledge. Somewhere in that trajectory, the settled silence was established. Somewhere in that trajectory, the decision was made that what is known privately will remain known privately, that the private history will not be introduced into the public one, that the archive, the real archive, the one that lives in her, will remain sealed. There are theories about why this decision was made. Some suggest it was made out of genuine conviction that disclosure would be harmful, that the full private knowledge of the Kennedy assassination, if released, would not simply answer historical questions, but would destabilize institutions and damage reputations in ways that serve no constructive purpose. Some suggest it was made out of personal protection or a recognition that the forces that killed her father and her uncle are not necessarily spent, that speaking too clearly about what is known could carry risks that outweigh the benefits of historical clarity. Some suggest it was made out of a kind of loyalty to her mother, to her uncle, to the people who carried private knowledge through dangerous years and made their own decisions about what to hold and what to release. Perhaps all of these theories are partially true. Perhaps none of them capture the full complexity of a decision made over a lifetime in response to circumstances that no one outside that life can fully appreciate. What can be said with confidence is that the decision exists, that it is settled, and that it produces in everyone who has been close enough to sense it the unmistakable impression of enormity contained. The silence that speaks says, "There is something here." The silence that speaks says, "It is larger than you know." The silence that speaks says, "I have made my peace with carrying it, and that peace is not yours to disturb." Every generation believes it is on the verge of learning the full truth about the Kennedy assassination. Every new document release, every new investigation, every new book or documentary or scholarly analysis generates a fresh wave of confidence that this time the final piece of the puzzle will fall into place. And every time, the confidence is disappointed, not because the effort was insufficient, not because the researchers were incompetent, but because the puzzle itself is not simply a matter of undiscovered evidence. It is a matter of deliberately managed knowledge, of information that exists, that has been known, that has been held and calibrated and selectively disclosed over 6 decades by institutions and individuals who have never fully surrendered it. The Kennedy assassination in this reading is not a cold case. It is not a mystery waiting to be solved by the right investigator with the right documents. It is an ongoing exercise in the management of historical knowledge, an exercise that has been conducted with varying degrees of skill and varying motivations by the intelligence community, by successive administrations, by the institutional custodians of the public narrative, and by the family that experienced the event most directly. What history has not been permitted to know falls into several broad categories. It does not know the full extent of institutional awareness of Oswald prior to the assassination. It does not know the full scope of Robert Kennedy's private investigation and its findings. It does not know the substance of Jacqueline Kennedy's private beliefs about her husband's death, beyond the fragments that have leaked into the historical record through secondary accounts. It does not know what private knowledge was transmitted within the Kennedy family, through what channels and to what effect. It does not know what materials remain in private family holdings that have never been disclosed to any outside researcher or institution. And it does not know what Caroline Kennedy knows. This last unknown is, in some ways, the most significant of all, because the others are institutional unknowns, gaps in the public record produced by the decisions of organizations and administrations that have their own logics and their own interests. The unknown of what Caroline Kennedy knows is a personal one. It is the unknown of a single human being who has inherited an extraordinary private history and who has made, with the full exercise of her intelligence and her judgment, a set of deliberate choices about what to do with it. According to some reports, there have been moments in her private conversations, moments that have been described at second or third hand by people who were adjacent to them, in which the weight of what she carries has been briefly visible, a reference too specific to be general to the complexity of what surrounded her father's death, an acknowledgement too informed to be merely conventional that the public record does not tell the full story, a quality of knowing that in the accounts of people who have observed it goes beyond the natural historical awareness of a well-educated and deeply interested descendant. These moments are not evidence in any formal sense. They are impressions. They are the kind of data that does not belong in academic footnotes, but that human beings, when they are paying close attention, know how to read. They suggest a private knowledge that is specific, that is informed, that is based on something more than educated inference. They suggest a woman who is not simply uncertain about her father's assassination in the way that all thoughtful students of the subject are uncertain. They suggest a woman who has, somewhere in the private archive of her understanding, a picture that is more complete than the one available to the rest of the world. What the picture contains, what specific elements it adds to the public record, what specific questions it answers, what specific forces it names, is not known and may never be known. The choices that have been made about what to hold and what to release, the settled disposition of silence that has governed her engagement with these questions for decades, the extraordinary discipline of a lifetime spent carrying private knowledge in public, all of these suggest that whatever she knows, she has made her peace with not sharing it within any time frame that can currently be anticipated. There are theories about what might change this, about the circumstances under which the private archive might begin to open. Some insiders suggest that the full declassification of government records, if it ever truly comes, might create an environment in which private disclosure becomes both safer and more necessary. If the institutional suppressions are finally removed, the argument goes, the private ones may follow. There are theories suggesting that as the historical distance from the events increases, and as the people whose reputations and interests have required suppression either die or lose their relevance, the calculus of disclosure might shift. There are theories suggesting that the existence of Kennedy family papers in various institutional archives, which have their own timelines and their own eventual disclosure requirements, might produce, decades from now, materials that shed light on what was known privately. But all of these theories depend on a future that cannot be predicted. What exists in the present is a woman of considerable age, considerable distinction, and considerable private knowledge who has consistently chosen across a lifetime to honor the silence that her inheritance required. She has fulfilled, in the most complete sense possible, the obligation that history placed on her. She has carried what she was given. She has managed what she inherited. She has maintained what she was trusted to maintain. Whether history will judge this as the right decision is a question that depends entirely on what the private knowledge actually contains. If it confirms the public narrative, then the silence was arguably unnecessary. If it contradicts the public narrative, if it answers the questions that 6 decades of official investigation have failed to answer, then the silence was the most consequential act of historical withholding in modern American life. Neither possibility can be ruled out. Both must be held simultaneously in the same suspension of certainty that Caroline Kennedy herself has maintained for all these years. History has not been permitted to know, and the permission has been withheld by one person in one lifetime with one deliberate and irreversible act of silence. In the autumn of her life, Caroline Kennedy remains what she has always been, a figure of extraordinary visibility and extraordinary opacity. She attends the ceremonies, she delivers the remarks, she accepts the honors and fulfills the obligations of her remarkable position at the intersection of American history and American memory. She does all of this with the composed watchfulness that has characterized her public life from the beginning, and she says nothing on the questions that matter most that she has not carefully decided to say. She is, at this point, the last living link to the world that ended in Dallas on November 22, 1963. The last person alive who was present in that world, who was close enough to its center to absorb its private dimensions, who was trusted by her mother, by her uncle, by the constellation of people who carried private knowledge of the Kennedy era, with a share of what that world actually knew. The witnesses are almost entirely gone, the investigators are gone, the principals are gone. The people who sat in the rooms and heard the private assessments and received the private materials are, with very few exceptions, gone. She is what remains. According to some insiders, this is a position she has always understood. The weight of being the last living repository of a private historical understanding is not something that developed gradually or settled on her in old age. It was, in a sense, her inheritance from the beginning. She was born into it. She grew up inside it. She was shaped by it. And she has spent her entire adult life learning to carry it with a grace that is, whatever else it may be, genuinely extraordinary. There are theories about what will happen to the knowledge she carries when she is gone, about whether she will, at some point before that, choose a different kind of disclosure, about whether the Kennedy family papers will eventually reveal what the living Kennedy has not, about whether the accumulation of official declassifications combined with whatever private materials may eventually enter the public record will gradually assemble a picture that approaches the private one she carries. Some insiders believe that the truth of the Kennedy assassination, the full private institutional truth that has been managed and withheld for 60 years, will never be fully known, that the people who had the most direct knowledge died with it, that the documents that contained the most sensitive details were destroyed, that the private knowledge that survived the immediate aftermath has been, through decades of careful management, so thoroughly separated from any external verification that it can never be confirmed against any available evidence. In this reading, what Caroline Kennedy knows, or what she is believed by many to know, will die with her, not because she has been negligent, not because she has failed in any obligation, but because the architecture of concealment that was constructed in the aftermath of Dallas was simply too thorough, too patient, too institutionally embedded to be overcome by any single act of disclosure, however dramatic. There are other theories, and there are always other theories. That is perhaps the most accurate thing that can be said about the Kennedy assassination, that it has generated and continues to generate more theory than certainty, more question than answer, more mystery than resolution. It is a wound in the American historical consciousness that has never properly healed, in large part because the conditions for healing, full transparency, genuine accountability, the complete release of what was known and when, have never been met. Caroline Kennedy is not responsible for that wound. She did not inflict it. She inherited it, along with everything else that the Kennedy name and the Kennedy tragedy entailed. She has managed it over a lifetime with a responsibility and a discretion that, on one level, commands respect regardless of what one believes about the private knowledge it conceals. But the questions do not go away. They cannot go away because the answers have not been given. And the person who is most likely to have the answers, who has, according to the convergence of private testimony and reasoned inference, at least a version of them, is still alive, is still watchful, is still maintaining, with the extraordinary discipline of a lifetime, the silence that her inheritance required. What did Jacqueline Kennedy whisper to her daughter in the unrecorded moments before she died? What did Robert Kennedy's trusted circle pass to the family in the years between Dallas and his own death? What do the materials in the private Kennedy archive contain that no cataloger has ever been permitted to see? What is the woman who grew up inside the most significant unresolved mystery in modern American history, who absorbed its private dimensions from the people closest to its center, who has spent her entire adult life positioned at the intersection of private knowledge and public obligation? What does she actually know? The answer exists. It is held somewhere in the private architecture of a woman who has made her peace with carrying it. It may outlast her. It may die with her. It may, one day, in circumstances that cannot currently be predicted, find its way into the light. But today, as it has been for every day of her adult life, it remains exactly where she has kept it, held in a silence so complete, so practiced, so fully inhabited, that it has become indistinguishable from the woman herself. History will remember Caroline Kennedy as many things, as a daughter, as a public servant, as a keeper of her family's legacy, as a figure of quiet dignity in the long aftermath of catastrophic loss. Some insiders believe history will remember her as something else entirely, as the person who knew, who always knew, who carried the answer to the question that has haunted American life for more than 60 years, and who took it with the same composed watchfulness she brought to everything, to the very edge of what history is permitted to record. And in the silence that follows, in the enormous, loaded, historically consequential silence that has accompanied her through every decade of her public life, the question that has never been answered keeps asking itself, what does she know? And perhaps more importantly, what will she decide to do with it before time makes that decision for her?